So as Maggie was saying, I'm in the research and conservation department at the Botanic Gardens, which it's very common for people to actually not realize necessarily that we do have a department of folks that actually work outside the garden walls. We have all sorts of projects going on across the state in the conservation realm. So we monitor rare plants, we have restoration projects. My role is, if I'm gonna put like a name on it, is somewhat like as a disturbance ecologist. So that just means like you have a system and there's some sort of change or perturbation to that system that comes through a wildfire, maybe a change in hydrology, a biological invasion situation, like something like cheatgrass comes in, and like what happens to those wild plant communities when you have this kind of major change come through. So that's like one area of focus. And then another one more and more for me, but that's also kind of more recent, is getting more into some urban ecology work, which a lot of that is kind of mission driven in terms of the garden's mission to serve the local public, because we occur in the middle of the city and we want to create information and research that's relevant to the people that live near the gardens, that visit the gardens and such. So if you have any questions as I'm going along, please, I just want this to be casual. Just interrupt, stop me, throw a question out. If there's anything I'm saying that needs clarification or whatnot, just feel free to ask for it. That's no problem. And I do thank you guys all for being here. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about some research that's been going on. This is the third year now that we've been monitoring some tree plantings that they're doing along the Highline Canal. And good question. And I will kind of break that down a little bit, but the partnership that I have is with the Highline Canal Conservancy. So they're a nonprofit group that has been very much instrumental in shepherding this Highline Canal Greenway that we're going to go and walk along in a little bit. So they are kind of partly planting the trees themselves and or facilitating plantings along the corridor with a lot of the jurisdictions. There's 11 jurisdictions that manage different parts of that greenway. So like, for example, another group that is putting in some trees that we're monitoring is Greenwood Village, the municipality itself. So here's a picture of a chinkapin oak, and you can see it's not doing so well. Why is that? That's one of the big kind of overarching questions of this project. But I like to start off with this photo. It's maybe one you've seen before. I feel like it surfaces a lot. I just feel like it's a really stark, kind of visceral visualization of how important shade is. You know, in a grassland environment like this, you see all of these sheep are kind of like huddling under the shade provided by, you know, the windmill structure, because there aren't trees to use, right? So it's kind of like, we're no different. I like to follow up with this picture, right? Here we are. This is an outreach event that I did a couple years ago, and we're doing the same exact thing, right? We're thermoregulating. We're finding a shady spot so that we can comfortably congregate, talk to one another, be comfortable and relaxed within the shade of the tree that's being provided in this park. So shade is a really clear, obvious kind of ecosystem service, is a term that gets used of trees, but they provide all sorts of ecological services. So they store carbon in their trunks, right? They sequester and hold a lot of carbon. So that's, for example, why it can be such a problem to cut down thousands and thousands of acres of forest. You're releasing a lot of like carbon into the atmosphere. They scrub pollutants from the air. Their deep ramifying roots create air spaces and percolation pockets for, like, when it rains, for water to come in and percolate down into the deep soil layers. So they have all of these things, wildlife habitat, of course, all of these services that they provide, not to mention aesthetic and cultural value to humans. So they're important for a lot of reasons. And they cost money in urban systems, right? It costs money to put trees into the ground and to get them to establish and to maintain them over time. So there was a study a while back estimating that, you know, across 5 cities in the US, including Fort Collins was one of the cities that was in this study, trees cost an average of $32 per tree per year to who usually municipalities.
But like the trees in my yard,
This is based on municipality cared for trees. Yeah, so like street trees, park trees, not privately owned trees. Yeah, so it costs those municipalities on average $32 per tree per year, right? So if you scale that up across the size of an entire city that has thousands and thousands of trees, and yeah, well, there was a range. This study found a range of even lower than this. I forget what the low end of the range was, but this was the average. The highest was $65 per tree per year. That includes, yes, that includes planting. It includes replacing. If there's attrition, it includes irrigation. It includes maintenance. I agree that it sounds low. That's the numbers that they came to here. So if there's other resources that you know of, or you know, really, because there might be, but this was like a very kind of detailed look at the cost over the lifetime of the tree. So you can see several examples here. So like this is a catalpa here. Who's Mike? Which person is Mike? Mike, hi. So Mike is also studying and interested in catalpas. So this catalpa is, you know, this is like 1 year after this went into the ground, and you can see that it's likely not going to make it, right? So a lot of these trees are being planted actually with volunteers. So that lowers the cost, right? It can be. This particular effort is happening in collaboration with the park people. So they are training the volunteers on the tree plantings. But yeah, so there's a sunk cost to that still, right? There's the mulching, there's, you know, the staff infrastructure of getting the volunteers out there, et cetera. Irrigation, of course, across the semi-arid West. And maintenance, safety, especially along like a corridor like the High Line Canal. There's a lot of having to check the trees to make sure that there aren't any safety issues with all those people that are walking and running and using that area under the limbs of the trees. So there's a cost. And, you know, of course, again, in these semi-arid locations here, it's even more difficult for us here because this is semi-arid short grass steppe, right? If people weren't here putting trees onto the landscape, really the only places you'd be finding trees would be along our waterways where you would have your cottonwood galleries, your willows, or as you go up in elevation and get into snowy areas with evergreens. So everything that we're seeing in town here is being irrigated, or else it wouldn't be here. So that's a picture of Denver from the late 1800s. There, you know, there are no trees. This is
actually this year is because there's been such an emphasis on don't water the lawn. There's so many lawns are not being watered, and there's so many tree mortality happening because people.
The irrigation, right? The irrigation system covers the lawn and the tree, right? Yeah. Yes, that's another whole can of worms, which is the turf grass conversation, and trying to move away from, you know, the high irrigation need Kentucky bluegrass situation, but there needs to be some best practices put in place and like provided to people to kind of figure out how you do that.
I think most of the aspects here down are from the border, no water.
And this is the difficult, this is exactly kind of the crux of this type of approach that I'm going to be talking about, which is you see trees dying all the time and you go, is it just aging out? Is it drought? Is it being attacked by a pest? Like what exactly is causing the decline of the tree? And I'll touch on the emerald ash borer too a little later on. But here we are in our semi-arid system, treeless, unless we do a lot of work to get them in the ground and keep them there. And as you may know, a lot of our street trees, they're eastern deciduous forest trees, right? So we actually do call them xeric street trees. You might hear people refer to it that way, but that's a relative term. There's xeric relative to our native cottonwoods and willows that really need like quite a lot of water. But they're not xeric trees in the sense of like being truly low water. They're eastern deciduous forest trees. Yeah.
There's a shrubby cinquefoil. That's,
Yep.
and that's Wesley's favorite example of how they call that xeric. Well, in Illinois, it is a xeric plant. It can
Right.
tolerate intermittent periods of Illinois droughts.
Mhm.
But in our area, it's an indicator
Of wetland. Absolutely. So it's all relative. Yeah. So when you hear that term, xeric, what does that actually mean? So municipalities, cities, counties, they're all needing to kind of face this fact that we have our horticultural palettes. Much of it is from eastern locations that require a lot more water. Of course, there's lots of conversation that go on within CONIPs and all sorts of groups of like, using natives that are lower water. But with trees, that's hard, right? Because we don't have native choices for trees very much. So water demand is increasing, climate change is a reality. So this is a quote from the Denver Parks and Recreation Water Management Plan. Climate change is putting pressure on the city's park systems. The droughts are projected to increase. And this water management plan is, they're planning forward for a time where the irrigation budgets for Kentucky bluegrass, for trees is only going to be less, not more. So we have to think about what we're putting into the ground. And I guess the goal of this project is to help people get some data. So we have some numbers to look at. So this I just pulled yesterday. This is the current drought situation across Colorado, and you can, follow this U.S. Drought Monitor website. It's not, there's years where it's much, much more severe, but we're always seemingly in some degree of water stress across the state. So the yellow is abnormally dry. The dark orange is severe drought. The mid-range orange is moderate drought. This is the U.S. Drought Monitor website. You can just Google that, and it's
They've got the definitions on site. Oh.
yep. So it's that key right there. And there actually are like a lot of different ways to define drought. So that's actually quite a good question. I'm not sure exactly how they're defining it here. And I should have looked that up.
Severe drought in
Yeah.
southeastern Boulder County.
Mm-hmm.
We were at the beginning of May in Louisville.
Mm-hmm.
We had twice as much precipitation as we should have had for that day. Since then,
Mm-hmm.
in Louisville, we might have had 2.5 inches of rain since the beginning of May.
Yeah.
Now, other areas to the south and to the north have done better, but
Yeah.
that part of Boulder County
Yeah.
really,
And that's another aspect of the expectations for drought is what's called like a repackaging of the rain events that we get, where rather than having kind of, if you guys, I don't know, memory is always squishy, right? But it seems like over the last 20 odd years, we've lost that more consistent monsoonal pattern where most afternoons you can kind of expect like a thunderstorm to build and come through. The expectation is that the rain events are getting larger but less often. So
we've gone from the zone.
what you just said,
Zone of flow, the perturbations along to an omega shape. Yes. And so things stay more north-south instead of that east-west flow, and they stagnant.
yeah,
So we're getting those long stretches.
yeah, long stretches with nothing, and then maybe some really severe. I mean, my basement flooded I don't know if folks are from around Denver proper, but my basement flooded like 2 or 3 weeks ago with one of the rain events that came through. The street, right by the gardens, right off Cheeseman Park was flowing and flooding, from the rain event. It's just so much so quickly. So,
It is so funny you were saying the memories. The very first year I
Yeah.
lived in Colorado was in Colorado was 1958.
Yeah.
Beautiful. I like had never seen a monsoon in my life. I was like, this is so fun.
Yeah.
You know, as fun as the sunset. But yeah,
yeah, every day, and then it would cool everything down,
Yeah.
and yeah. I think I moved here in 98 also. Yeah. So given the fact that we need trees, they're expensive, they require resources. We're living in an area where it's not so easy to maintain them, to get them to establish. It behooves us to have more information. So there's different ways to get information. And this is maybe an oversimplification, but I'm just trying to kind of like draw a little bit of like a distinction between ways that we can learn about the world, trees or otherwise. And there's heuristic approaches, and then there's these ecological sampling approaches that I'm going to talk about. And that heuristic approach is the expert practitioner, which is a very valuable, important way of knowing about things. And then when I say that, that just means an individual who has extreme expertise. Like, so a forester, a city forester who's been working for 30 years and watching trees for 30 years, right? And they know, like, if you put that, if you put that catalpa here in this part of this yard, and it's not going to survive, right? That information is important and needs to be continued to be used. And what I'm talking about here is another way of looking at things that can hopefully potentially be complementary to that, which is like, how do you like externalize that expert knowledge? Like almost like get some sort of like download of all of the things that these experts know in a format that has like some data that folks can look at, patterns. So in order to do that, you need replication, you need lots of trees, and you need protocols that are like systematically followed, and you need multiple years of data. It's resource intensive to monitor, which is why it's difficult to have monitoring data, because people don't have time to do it. That makes sense, right? So hopefully, the resources that we have at the gardens can like help fill a gap on this monitoring side of things. So what do I mean by this ecological approach to assessing tree health? So this is Layla. She was on my field crew a few years ago. She's was an undergrad at CU Denver at the time, and she's measuring tree height. Straightforward. What causes trees to survive or not? What shapes how quickly they grow? Okay, so that's our response variable, tree survival and growth. And we know things that affect it are light availability, soil moisture availability, competition from surrounding plants. Like that tree is like so surrounded by smooth brome right there. How important is that competition? We know it is, or else we wouldn't mulch around our trees. We know soil moisture is important, or else we wouldn't bother to mulch. But which things are most important? And does it depend on the tree species you're looking at? Topography is a big thing, right? That likely might affect competition depending where you are. And I'm talking about this specific system, the Highline Canal, has like all this topographic variation. So the slope of the bank, how long the bank is, that can affect soil moisture availability. That could probably affect light availability. All of a sudden, things are starting to get very complicated, right? Light availability probably affects how much soil moisture you're going to have, and on and on. So how do we, yes?
I watch and plant trees in our park, and it also extreme weather events. I mean, they can put it in, and then we have early frost, or we have late snow.
Yes.
So do you have that variable in there? 'Cause
I-
that really ruins it.
I don't have it as a direct. I can maybe go back and try to get weather records from nearby weather stations and things like that. I don't have it as a direct just observation by me, just because I'm not out there, but I might show up to a tree and be like, oh, this branch has snapped off. And so it probably was from the snow that was last week, things like that. But yeah, there's a lot of things like that that are like these one-off events that you kind of have to sleuth backwards and kind of figure it out to a certain extent. Yeah, but you're right. Sometimes those rare, unfortunate timing things like a frost problem. So the little like ecological laboratory or study, system for this is the Highline Canal. I just want to point out, did I remind myself to say it somewhere? Clearly, this is a relatively, I'm talking about urban trees. This is a very benign habitat, right? We're not talking about like a concrete sidewalk in downtown Denver. My hope, though, is that this could be kind of an example. You could take this approach and you could modify it and use it anywhere throughout the city. The factors that you're focusing on might be different. Like you might be focusing on, well, what's the soil volume of the tree well in the sidewalk versus what's the slope of the bank here. But it's like kind of a blueprint way of thinking about what are all the things that interact to shape whether this tree makes it or not. So the Highline, right, as I mentioned earlier, like none of this woody growth would really be here if this canal hadn't been dredged back in the late 1880s. So I love some of these historic pictures of the dredging of the canal with the big horse teams. So yeah, so this is back in the late 1880s. That's Waterton Canyon right there, and that's the inception of the canal from the South Platte River. And basically the canal never operated very efficiently. So the goal was to move water out across like kind of this northeastern extent so people could farm and settle and have water for crops and food. And it has earthen canal banks, right? So just a lot of the water evapotranspirated or directly evaporated out of the canal, and it just wasn't efficient. These were like English businessmen who were taking their mindset from a much wetter place and just trying to drop it here, and it did not work. So in the 1970s, Denver Water, this is like the old Ditch Rider Road. This canal trail that goes along the canal proper was the Ditch Rider Road that they used to maintain the canal, and Denver Water opened it up in the 1970s for people to use for recreation. So that's the main use now. So you can see, and there's lots of conversation that's going on about all of the cottonwoods that are dying off along the canal corridor. That's the main kind of big shade tree, along with ash trees and other species. But they're dying out. They're largely probably just naturally aging out. They came onto the canal over 100 years ago, so they're just coming to the natural end of their lifespan. But at the same time, there is less water being run through the canal from the inception at the South Platte. So, when we're working out on the canal, people stop all the time. Like I've lived here 30 years and they've been watching the canal every day, and they're seeing like a lot less water in the canal. So there are some projects going on, some green stormwater infrastructure projects going on where they're putting in some berms and different infrastructure so that when it does rain, the water is kind of shunted into the canal and it gets held there for a little while to allow that. It's called slow spread and sink the water, to allow it to kind of seep into the canal banks. So you can see this is dieback here on this tree. And if you look, across this picture as well, you can see that there's dieback from the tips of the cottonwoods. So that's showing that they're in decline. The ash tree, I think I put a stat somewhere. Yeah, ash tree makes up 16% of the mature trees on the canal. So we don't have the emerald ash borer here yet along the canal, but it's been spotted in Littleton. So you know, the city foresters are preparing for basically kind of a massive loss of the ash trees in the upcoming decades. This is like a devastating development for a place like the High Line and for the whole city. I mean, there's so many ash trees throughout the city. You might see on some trees, it says I've been treated, you know, they're treating some of the older trees. So this is the point I wanted to make with this is this planting plan that's in place for the canal. They're trying to use a really diverse palette of trees, lots of different species. And you may have heard that's like really a discussion that happens a lot now in the forestry sector is you may have one tree that does so awesome, like honey locust does really well, but if you overpopulate your city tree stock with one species and then something that kills off that species moves through, all of a sudden you have an entire stand, you know, dominant stand worth of trees that you're losing at one time. So it can be very devastating. So that's a long-standing ecological principle, which is like diversity creates resistance and resilience because you have lots of variation to potential stressors among your species. So yes, the ash borer is probably on the way, and it's just pretty devastating. There's high mortality with this guy. So hence this plan for the Highline Canal. So if you go on to the Highline Canal Conservancy's website, they have lots of really great resources, and this plan is beautifully drawn up and was constructed with like multiple open houses with all of the people that live along the canal. They really tried to like co-develop this natural resources stewardship plan with the people that live along the canal. So this is such a cool study system for someone like me because the trees are being put into the ground. So that upfront cost, right, is happening with other entities. And then we have the ability to come in and try to help get data. And like I said earlier, this is a benign environment. So I'm not trying to pretend that these are urban street trees that are undergoing all the stress that you might expect on a street. But it's an interesting system to kind of test some of these ideas. So here is a map of, you know, a pretty decent, almost complete section of that Highline Trail, 71 miles. And each dot is a tree that we're monitoring. So it's all, you know, geo-referenced. And the different colors are just who planted the tree. So in our case, for what we're monitoring, it's either the Conservancy or Greenwood Village, and then the year that the trees went in. So we have 3 cohorts of trees. So our first cohort that went in 2021, we just this past summer got the 3rd year of data on those guys. And then we have a cohort that went in 2022, we'll monitor through 2025, etc. So we're getting 3 years of data across 3 planting time points with different weather, different conditions. And that's 373 trees, total of 10 species. And that's the locations. So today, we're just looking at, we're kind of walking along this one stretch here, just to give you context. Okay.
You've got a survival percentage?
Mhm. Yep. So this is the planting palette. These are all species that you're going to see throughout the city. These are kind of our workhorse street tree, xeric street tree species. Bur oak, chinkapin, and Schumer's oak, hackberry, catalpa, Kentucky coffee tree, and honey locust. Okay, so those are all, oh, well, I'll show you in the next slide. Those are all like kind of those eastern deciduous forest trees. And then we've got native riparian trees. So we've got cottonwoods. One of them is this Populus sargentii, which is synonymous with Populus deltoides subspecies monolifera. I'm going to show you another slide in a second to continue to unpack this. And the other is Populus deltoides, which is Populus deltoides subspecies whistlezennii. And then we have Acer negundo. So these are the trees that I was saying, you know, they're pretty much constrained to waterways. So if we look at this is called the Köppen climate classification. So it's just these broad level abiotic kind of distinctions of areas of the country. And they're based on precipitation and temperature. This whole area, based on this climate classification system, is warm temperate. And then as you move north, you're moving up into what's considered boreal. So these are higher precipitation locations than where we're at, which is getting into the brown area is arid. So this is this point that I was making earlier, which is if you look at the native distributions of, this is the chinkapin oak, oh, going off the screen, the bur oak, hackberry, honey locust, right? We're pulling our stock from places that have very different climates than we have here, which forces us to create local little microclimates for these trees that may not be sustainable for us to continue to create going forward. Yes.
These species are native to those North American locations right there.
Mhm.
So better than a tree that's overseas.
In term, depending on what your goal is, probably better in terms of like less risk of something becoming invasive. Because potentially like their natural enemies maybe also occur here. They're not climate matched, which means they're likely not going to escape off the Highline Canal and really far into some natural area because they can't. So for that goal of like lowering the risk of like an unwanted invasion, that's good. Versus like if you want trees that don't need a ton of irrigation and they're putting stress on your water supplies and that kind of thing, you'd go to a more steppe-like region and try to find material you'd try to climate match a little bit better, which comes with its own trade-offs. Yeah, like Siberia, yes, like Siberian elm, which doesn't need any irrigation whatsoever, right? So these are important conversations actually, because the nursery industry, I mean, they bioprospect, they go to other locations and they look for plant materials that might work here. And it takes them probably like 10 to 20 years to do all the R&D and all of the work that needs to be done to like bring up a supply that's commercially available. So the conversations of like risk and reward really need to happen on the front end of like when you're deciding to bring in new materials. I honestly don't know how my opinion on that is like, I'm very open to thinking through that. I studied biological invasions for like many years in the first part of my career. So I used to be a lot more like, do not bring anything ever over, like it's too risky. But at the same time, if we're facing a future where we have, you know, arid cities that don't have comfortable climates for people to be able to live in, yes, where do we go with that conversation? I think it's complicated. Yes.
Are they do they do anything with the understory or they just put the trees in and let the understory take care of itself?
The trees that we're monitoring for this project, they are mulching out to like the initial kind of drip line, so that where the canopy ends when they first go in, and then they're caging them. And that's it for the most part. Every once in a while, you'll see that they've mowed, but for the most part, they're not. That they do mow along the Highline Canal Trail, but they're not getting to the places where the trees are because they're a little further down the slope. Yeah, like sometimes they might get mowed just because they happen to just be so close to that mow line, but they're not managing specifically for that.
So what is kind of confusing or to me is, so really these trees there's a difference I'm thinking, I don't know, between trees that are providing like ecosystem services in terms of, like, you know, Doug Tallamy talks about the nature home and how oaks are so important. They're the ones that really for pollinators and caterpillars for birds, you know, oaks are key. But yet, so it seems to me like there's differences between those trees and then trees that we're just planting in an urban environment that really the main consideration is not providing those type of services. It's just providing shade or water or, yeah, it's like, you know, but you'll plant trees and you're taking care, well, you'll help the, you know, you'll help the shade canopy, you'll help with heat, you'll help, I mean, with a lot of stuff. And then, but yet you're really not maybe providing, it's not like you're looking at trees here that are all good, food for birds or pollinators. Except there's two things going on with the whole tree thing, and I'm kind of coming to the conclusion that, yeah, they're two separate things. It's not all one. Unfortunately.
Yes,
It might be
yes.
just moving inventory. I mean, the nurseries finally can sell something, they sell with no regard to.
No,
I think, so part of what you're saying has to do with, local context. In terms of like the oaks that Doug Tallamy's looking at, those are native to the region. So, right, so they have a long history of co-evolving with the insects and the pathogens and the birds and all the things that exist in that region. Whereas here, we're taking those species and we're plopping them down in a place where there may not be insects that recognize them as a host. It's possible though that they do provide that service. So at the end of the talk, I'm gonna talk about a phase 2 that we're going to be starting with this, which is to look at herbivory and what kind of things are feeding on the trees. Like, do they provide the types of services that you're talking about, which is food resources, nesting resources. What's that? Things change and evolve. Yep, absolutely. So things can evolve over time relatively rapidly, sometimes less so in trees because they have a very long generation time, but there's also species that are very generalist that can feed on these trees. So I'll show you a few pictures at the end of like where we're going to try to go with that. But Doug Tallamy's work, I think is something that is very ripe to be replicated in other areas, right? So that we can figure out which trees here provide those types of services. And is it a very different story since most of our trees in the cities are not native?
I mean, I know there are some native shrub / trees like chokecherry.
Yep, absolutely.
Gambles most of the time.
Right.
Kind of shrubby, less, I think it's with water and then
You can get bigger. Right.
And there are some others, but maybe those just really aren't. I mean, they're not on this list, so I mean, it's not something that is really pursued.
Yeah. Well, and that goes back to your point, right? So one of the goals for the trees they're putting on the highline is to provide shade. So the chokecherry, it's what you're saying, like, what's your goal with your tree?
Right.
And if it's shade, you're not going to get a chokecherry in there or, you know, a gamble oak, right? So yes, that's absolutely true. But those are the ones that might provide better habitat. So maybe you can do some like co-plantings of, right, the shrubby natives and the shade producing trees and yeah.
Does water table fluctuate a lot on the
Oh, gosh.
That
We are just in a very coarse way, like every time we visit a tree, we note whether or not there's water in the canal. It's been so hard to get data on the water periodicity within the canal because the USGS monitors like streams and larger water bodies, but canals are not monitored. And the highline is so localized, like when the water flushes in and drains out. So the only thing that's not really water table, but we're just at least getting information on like, how often is water in this spot?
There is water.
Yeah,
I would ask.
yes, underneath.
Right, is that pretty standard, is that pretty? Constant, or is that changing?
I don't know, and that's a very, very good question. It's a really good question, and if you know where I could find that information, do you know?
No, but you know, Pogo Ross, the like Colorado Rain and Snow Network of SCSU.
No, I don't.
Like, they give people gauges.
Yes.
Now, this, you can use the Western Regional Climate Center, but I don't know how close to your
Right,
thing is.
right.
But if you connect with Pogo Ross, like, you might be able to find out who has one along the map.
Okay, okay,
And it might just be a proxy, right, for presets.
it's okay.
But
It's better than,
it's really fun citizen science
Awesome.
setup. They just send you everything you need to have with a weather station in your document. So, yeah,
What's the name of the business?
it's like the Colorado Rain, Snow and Sleet Network, but I just like COCARHAS.
right, that just rolls off the tongue. Cool, okay. Maybe we will go to 10:30.
Well, we have been a very active.
Yes, this is awesome. The native riparian cottonwoods. So again, like here's kind of a picture of like a cottonwood gallery, right, growing right along a waterway. And then I had pointed out to you a little bit of that synonymy situation going on. So there's this populus deltoides subspecies Lislezenii. This eastern cottonwood has more of a west slope distribution, this subspecies. And then the populus sargentii is this subspecies monolifera, which has more of like an eastern plains distribution. And I'm just pointing that out because they've put both of these in as part of the tree planting palette. And we're just treating them separately to see like, you know, are they different? Do they behave different? Okay. So again, this is just such a neat little system because what it looks like if you just do a cross section of the canal is you have the canal. There may or may not be water in there, but it's certainly wetter down at like the bottom of that bank and in towards the canal than it is up at the top by the trail. So they're putting those xeric street trees up by the trail for shade. Maybe they come down the bank a little bit, and then they're putting the cottonwoods and the box elder really much closer down to the canal bed. But also there's some just variation in that placement. So this is like a proxy for that kind of heuristic practitioner choice of tree siting. Like where did they choose to put this tree relative to the canal bank was like a major deciding factor for them. And we can measure the effect of it. So what did we look at? So a lot of times I think about like data, you can describe patterns and then you can describe the processes or the mechanisms that are like shaping those patterns. And those are two different things. So describing patterns would be like, what's the proportion of survival over the first 3 years? What's the growth rate over the first season, the second season, the third season? We're just looking at this basic measure. The process is like, why? Yeah, why are they surviving or not? Why do they grow more quickly versus less quickly? This study will definitely be able to uncover patterns. The process part, I'm hoping we uncover it, and I'm going to show you this way that I'm thinking about going about it. It's a little bit complicated and will not in any way be replacing that heuristic or practitioner expertise, but it's just another way to think about how can we understand what's going on with the trees. So we're looking at survival height, diameter at breast height, that percent canopy dieback that I showed you on a couple of those cottonwoods, epicormic shoots, right? Those shoots that can come from the base of the tree or even a little bit further up the trunk, which typically are considered to indicate stress. And the live crowd ratio, I'm not going to get into today, but that's basically like for a given species, like how much proportionally, if you look over the whole tree, how much of it is canopy, which is, you know, that photosynthetic material versus trunk infrastructure to be maintained. It's just kind of like an allocation metric. So this is survival. So we have the xeric street trees over here. These are our 3 oaks. In the middle, we have the hackberry, the catalpa, Kentucky coffee tree, honey locust. And then on the right, we have the native riparians, which I'm sorry are a little off the screen. The take home here, so we just finished getting the 3rd year of data, so I didn't have a chance to update these, but the take home here is like, for all these guys that I'm highlighting in this box, all the oaks, most of the xerics, except for the hackberry, and then the box elder, super high survival, like 90+% survival over 2 years, which is like extremely good. A, because it's a benign environment. B, they are getting irrigated 30 gallons of water every 2 weeks. Okay, so they're being very pampered. So their survival is really good. The survival is less good for the hackberry in the center. And so this is year 1. And then by year 2, we're getting more attrition. Once we, get a 3rd year of data, maybe we'll see more. So the hackberry was down to about 80% survival by year 2. Oops. And both of those cottonwoods were down to about 80% survival by year 2. So losing more trees more quickly for those 3 species.
I mean, what just for the first 3 years of the conflict?
Yeah, I think I have to actually recheck that because the other day I was questioning myself. I think it's for the first 3 years. It's not indefinitely, but I also need to recheck how many years they're committed to. And it's a good question. I was just talking to someone the other day that was like, you have to keep monitoring in the years where they stop watering. You have to find a way because otherwise you're missing the good stuff. So that survival is like really high, but not all surviving trees are thriving, right? So I can go out to this catalpa and that catalpa, and they're both going to be surviving, but one of them probably isn't going to be surviving for too much longer. So there's a lot of variation in how they're doing. So survival is one thing. That's a very typical metric to be used because it's easy. And again, monitoring, there's not a lot of resources for it. The growth takes longer to measure. Yeah. They're all going in at 1 to 1.25 dBH diameter. But I don't have the initial heights. I have the initial diameter. So I can at least know that as a controlled thing. And I'm not actually showing diameter today, but the responses for diameter have been similar to height for what I'm going to show today in terms of like growth rates. Because they're correlated pretty nicely. Okay, so not all surviving trees are thriving, right? So here is a cottonwood. You can see there's a bunch of dieback versus one that has none. Again, dieback. So this is a very minor amount of dieback, but you can actually see right up at the tip, at that leader, you're getting dieback. Right at the tip, at the leader, you're getting dieback. One thing I'm interested in, if you read about dieback as like a symptom of decline, it's unclear, like, is that like the death knell for this tree, or can you get 10 years out of it, 15 years out of it? I'm kind of interested in like, can you even use just a small amount of leader dieback to kind of know, 5 years from now, this guy's a goner no matter what, and I don't know the answer to that. So that's very minor dieback. What does that mean over the longer term? This is very severe dieback, right? So this catalpa, you're getting like 40% dieback here. This is a Quercus macrocarpa, the bur oak. You can see they're pruning the heck out of it. They're trying to save it, but you can look at that tree and just go like, this guy's going to be on its way out, most likely. Okay, so there's, yes. Resprouting from the base. Yeah. And in fact, a lot of the trees, I feel like, they will come through. And the thing that I've learned is it is really hard to know what happened because you'll come through and that main stem is gone. And you've got profuse epicormic regrowth for a lot of the species, including.
They can cut or beers.
Yeah.
You don't even know there's a bridge fault.
Absolutely. If you like dig in, you're like, oh, yep. Yes. That's happening with a lot of the trees out there. And again, interesting to know, okay, it's gonna survive, but like, is it gonna like provide shade along the path? Or maybe not?
We assume that those two trees were on a regular water course. In other words.
They should be.
This happened despite the water.
This happened in spite of the watering. They are, Super Trees is contracted to water these
Okay.
guys. Yep. So they are getting watered every 2 weeks. So this is happening despite watering in a very benign environment, tons of soil volume. I mean, it's still happening.
You know, versus, yeah, every 2 weeks for 30 gallons, and maybe once a week, 15 gallons. I mean, I don't know. So I'm looking at that as all of those, just that's a constant, every 2 weeks.
That's a constant, which is nice for the study. But my understanding, the typical recommendation is more infrequent but very deep watering, rather than frequent but shallow watering. So give it a big drench less often, because that gives it a chance to proliferate the roots downward. But yes, I mean, that's what we're trying to find out. Like, okay, that's the recommended amount of watering, and here's what's happening. So what needs to be done differently?
Are the trees practically, are any trees, are the trees
They're
cutting?
They're-
from where?
they're going in as bare root. Bare root, they're coming out of the nursery quite well grown already. I don't know if they're originally grafted, but they're, yeah.
On the shop.
A lot of trees are grafted because they're trying to maintain the genetics of like that specific phenotype, like that amount of canopy, that amount of growth. What? Okay, so yeah, so I guess I don't understand. Do you mean grafted like in the nursery stock setting or grafted? I don't know. That's something I'd have to look into for each species from like the nurseries.
Are
So
they from Super Tree?
I don't know where all of them are from. So these are all questions that are like needing to be filled out for me. And I am going through like it's the natural resources manager at the Highline that like has facilitated all of this. So like I just don't know off the top of my head. They're going in as bare root, but I don't know if they grew them from seedling. You know, I don't know how they did it in the nursery. Yeah, well, this is from this year. So he's been in the ground this tree has been in the ground for 3 years. So it's grown quite a bit.
You know, we've lost several things many years after when we weren't gathering things and pulling the plant out of the ground and seeing that
Oh,
the
yeah.
tree years and years later was killed by it circling.
Burrowing up.
By the girdling.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it would be really cool to actually be able to excavate, like, but a lot of times I'll come back to a site and the tree's just gone, like it's been removed, you know? So in terms of like how the trees are propagated in the nursery, what do you think that could like help us to understand in terms of what goes on then once they go in the ground?
If they're all cut and grown, they would have be all the same genotype.
Yeah, right.
They'd have exactly the same
Right.
genes. If they're seedling grown, there would be
A bunch of variation.
in
Yeah.
Their expression.
Yes.
And if they're grafted, it seems like there could be problems with the graft and the.
Just with like the physical,
Just the-
mechanical, Yeah, that's something I'll definitely have to find out because if they're all different genetics. I hope they're grafted. Because if they're all different genetics, that's like confounding to this question.
Yeah.
I don't know. It was, yeah,
Well, that, we don't mean to ask.
no, it's fine.
But I would think that in the state nursery, I assume if they're dairy, that's where they're coming from, because they're the biggest supplier of dairy trees in the state. And I think that those are all plants, but I'm not sure.
Mhm.
I just noticed there are 5 messages in the chat.
Oh, no.
And
I did not notice.
I'm not stopped and say, do you want to take a question from the chat? Just for a sec, see what they have to say over here. Sorry, can't really. All right. Oh, they want us to repeat
Can't hear the audience questions.
Sorry about that. folks.
Okay, I'll repeat them. I'm doing that because.
I was, I didn't hear myself, but I was like, "Stop." I like to do the computer.
Okay, so good question. Important thing that I need to like follow up with the people that are doing the plantings to see like where they're sourcing the trees from. I really hope that they're grafted. Yeah, which oftentimes I have found is not necessarily known. Like the provenance is not always tracked. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. So you're right. That's another important thing to know. Like, what is the provenance? Okay, so epicormic shoots, we just touched on those, right? So here's a chinkapin showing some stress, not only from like the dieback from the tips, but it's showing some epicormic shoots. So we're keeping track of that as well. Okay, so some data. So for the percent dieback, so these are just all the species here on the x-axis. And for the most part, what this shows is, I hate to leave the people online and walk away, but there's very little dieback, so each dot is a tree. So this shows a couple things. One thing it shows is that, so these are the means, and it shows how misleading means can be if you don't know the data that underlie the means, right? Because like, so here's our hackberry, and there's quite a spread here around this mean, whereas for the populous subject, yeah, it's just being completely pulled up by 2 plants, right? So, or 2 trees. So for the most part, this is really just to show that it takes a lot of time to keep this type of data, and it tells you what's going on at the tree level. So for the most part, the Celtis is getting quite a bit of dieback. This is in the first year after going in the ground. You're getting some like number of trees. This is Kentucky coffee tree that are getting quite a bit of dieback. But for the most part, a lot of them are doing like quite well in terms of dieback. And just the same kind of patterns that you can look at for epicormic shoots. So you can see which trees, which species, and how many trees per species are showing some degree of stress via the epicormic shoots.
So, water stress, any stress.
I don't know. I mean, I think of it as probably water stress, but it could be what? Well, if you cut the trunk off, you're gonna get a lot of, like, yes, if the trunk apical meristem gets damaged, you're gonna get a lot of epicormic shoots. Go ahead.
But I always like. They have peace on that street, but it got planted too deep, or they didn't really realize
Yeah.
where that.
Yeah. And by the way, I don't know everybody else's backgrounds in this room. So if you have tree expertise, please like give me feedback, you know, that question that you had, right? Or other feedback. I'm happy to have it. Maybe we should have gone around the room and like talked about everybody's backgrounds. So that's the epicormic shoots. So this is, again, I'm like really just showing first year data because it's just, I haven't had a chance to kind of look at the second and third years. But again, just showing you how much variation you get among, first of all, among species, right? So here's the Catalpa speciosa. Generally as a species, not surprisingly, is much shorter than like the two populous species. But again, like if you're a city forester, maybe this information, just seeing this pattern is kind of a helpful thing to know if you want like big shade trees going in and you know, providing that particular service, how much variation is there among all of the different species to get to the point where you feel like you're reaching the kind of canopy that you want. Also, that variation is what we use to explore what drives differences among trees, right? So there's lots of variation there. What is causing the variation? All those things that I was talking about earlier. So that's height, and that's diameter at breast height. Again, just tons of variation. I guess I forgot to point out here, depending on the tree species, you know, there's a spread of from 1/2 meter to 2 meters difference in height. And for the DBH, there's a spread of 1/2 centimeter to more than 4 centimeters within a species. So is it genetic or is it driven by the environment, right? Every variation in a phenotype, whether it's height or DBH or whatever, is a combination of genetics and environment. So again, I'm hoping that these are all grafted. Okay, so I'm moving you towards thinking about structural equation modeling. Really, all that means is like this is a statistical approach that allows you to figure out what are the direct drivers or things that shape the response variable that you're interested in, whether it's tree height or number of epicormic shoots or whatnot. What are the things that directly shape it? And what are all the indirect interactions between everything else, like that picture that I was showing you earlier, that shape the entire outcome. So we're looking at all these responses that can be broken up into growth, stress, or just these allometric expressions of the trees. And so growth would be survival height and DBH. Stress would be canopy dieback, shoots, etc. And we can expect the drivers to be soil moisture, light, competition. And then we have all these mediating variables, right? Like soil texture, how far it is from the water, the slope of the bank, the length of the bank, etc. How do we take all of those things and start to draw out an understanding of which things are most strongly shaping how the trees are doing? And so we use structural equation modeling, and like this like kind of chaotic sleuthing, right? That like that's happening with Watson and Holmes in this picture is kind of how I think of the structural equation modeling. You're trying to draw the connections between all these dots. So the game is afoot. So this maybe looks a little bit overwhelming, but really it is pretty simple, right? So if we go back to the color coding here, right, we have the response, we have what's hypothesized to be these direct drivers that we all know are really important for shaping tree health. And then there's all these potential mediators. And like I was saying, this could be applied to any system. You could get more urban with it and decide what do you think are all of the drivers in your urban system, and you just use this same approach. So this is for, oh, did I forget? This is for the Populus deltoides subspecies Wislezenii. Am I remembering it correctly? This is the deltoides and this is the sargentii. Right, so we have this response variable, which is tree height. I'm sorry, I have to get up again. Sorry to the people online. These are what we hypothesize to directly affect the tree height, and these are these mediators. So the big picture here is that we are, and then red connections are a negative effect, and green connections are a positive relationship. So for example, of our 3 direct shapers, drivers of tree height, for the populus deltoides, soil moisture had a negative effect on tree height. So the more and more soil moisture that there was available, the shorter and shorter the trees were. So that's a very unexpected outcome. The more soil water available. So we had this little soil moisture sensor. So it's the percent volumetric soil moisture. So the wetter the soils, the less well the trees were doing. So that immediately was like that's the exact opposite of what we expected. This is something you would expect, right? You would expect that more and more competition there is, and it's grass competition. Like in the end, just perennial grass competition was the most important thing. As you would expect, like the more grass competition there was, the more of a negative effect it had on the tree height. And this makes sense too, right? This distance to water, I had kind of mentioned that before, as you could almost think of that as like a proxy for that siting decision. You know, when you're out there on the ground and you're deciding where to put your tree in, you're putting your xeric trees up slope, you're putting your riparian trees down the slope. And so what this is saying is that the further away you're getting from canal bed, less and less soil moisture you have. That makes sense, but it's just a validation of like that this model makes logical sense. And then the bank length and the bank slope do have varying indirect effects on these things that are then directly affecting the tree. So the big picture here is that the siting decision matters and does affect these things that are shaping the tree outcomes. Light availability did not matter in the first year. Not surprisingly, as you go further away from the canal bed and get closer to the trail, you're getting more and more light availability. So I just left that in there to show, like, again, that siting decision of where you are on the slope is going to affect all of these things. So that was an unexpected outcome. I'm going to show you, and then this for Populus sargentii is the main thing I want you to take from this. The siting relationships were less connected, except for you still get this one. This is coming through also for the Populus sargentii. The grass competition effect fell away, but you're getting this pathway here that the choice to put the trees closer to the water shaped the water availability, which had a negative effect on tree height. And I want to show you like actual, so that's maybe a little bit abstract, but here you have an actual tree height, so biologically tangible from 2 meters to 5 meters. And here's the Populus deltoides and the Populus sargentii. So here's the percent water availability from 10% up to 50%, right? And these relationships are so tight, like you never see that in ecology, especially that relationship is so tight. So that's showing you these trees are, almost 4 meters tall at 10% water availability, and which is low, relatively speaking. And as you get to this 50% here and 50% here, you're getting smaller and smaller. Yes.
What about the dieback or the could that actually be a survival benefit to not grow so tall so quickly? Right?
Yeah.
Maybe.
Does tree height relate to tree health?
In terms of dieback or in terms of
Yeah. Maybe
How are you-
all the time growing roots, because all that water it's spend time getting roots and it's gonna go up later.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It could be a difference in how they're solving the problem, right? Where they're proliferating roots first, and then maybe another year or two from now, those guys are gonna like shoot up. In terms of tree health, do you have a particular way you're thinking of like capturing that?
Canopy
Okay.
8%. Or
Yeah.
like, you know, what is the canopy?
Yeah, the only way we're assessing that is with the dieback. If there's another way, maybe we could talk about it.
So would you, would not have downward sloping?
That's a
Fine.
great question, and I can look and see. So we have pictures, of course, and we have the data, and I haven't looked at that yet. And that would be a great thing to look at, right? Because yeah, are those super healthy trees? They're just short, right? Or are they also in decline? We can look at that.
Because
Yeah,
they're what?
yes.
So they-
Mhm. Well,
Is what I'm thinking.
and that's why I'm kind of like hypothesizing, and I do not have the answer, and I won't know the answer from this work. But like, they need well drained, they are riparian, but they need well draining
Yeah.
soils.
Periodic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm wondering, and I don't know the answer, but like, is it too much of a good thing? Like they're too little bit, once they get too close to the canal bed, they just don't, they're not oxygenated enough, maybe. Yes,
You have the same analysis for like DBH versus the.
yes, DBH show, I don't have the, it's the same pattern. Yep, it's the same, it's the same pattern for both the Sargentii and the deltoides. Yep.
They cited these was, so I've done some forestry planting and. Anyway, was there any thought to where the current cottonwoods were? And then, so you plant them, obviously they've been successful in the area where they were, now conditions have changed. but
Right.
In planting the cottonwoods close to
Yes.
where.
Yeah. Yeah, the
Like
existing,
another tree, whatever, yeah.
the existing ones are mostly down low. To the canal bed. But you do find some though that are further up the slope and closer to the trail. And this is just my gut feeling, but like when they are close to the canal trail, the bank is very short. The bank length can be anywhere from, it could be a short, like 5 meters to like 20 meters. So if they're coming up off the canal bed very much, it's on a short length bank, if that makes sense. So they're still probably able to proliferate over to where the bank is. Yeah. So this is always, I'm just getting started looking at this. And it's always a situation where I don't necessarily have all the answers. I think the takeaway though is just using these approaches can highlight unexpected patterns that allow you to kind of go, like what's going on here? What else should we be looking at? So that's just a couple of examples with the SEM, right? And you can use that to look at any response variable that I talked about in relationship to these characteristics. So you can use it to uncover these indirect or unexpected effects. It's definitely in the like blueprint stage or it's complicated stage. Like, I wouldn't walk away from any of this at this point and saying like this should take the place of just expert knowledge of like, let's put the tree here or here or here. But I'm hoping that it's just an interesting thing to bring to the table to think about. And I actually just think just the straight summaries, even just like survival over time, hopefully can be interesting. Like a lot of the work that gets done is kind of like at that canopy level, like using satellite imagery or LiDAR and things like that to know like, well, we have 15% canopy cover in Denver, but like zooming in to like that more kind of local scale thing. Yes, sorry, structural equation modeling. Yep. Okay, so going back to like the Doug Ptolemy conversation, I think a neat thing to do next would be to get more serious about looking at like what kind of herbivory and pathogen damage we're seeing on the trees. These are all pictures from this past season. A lot of the trees are getting hit by the Japanese beetle, not surprisingly. But still, you can come at that from like an ecological concept of like, are they working as additional host plants for these species that are maybe reservoirs for like nearby gardens to, whatever, there's all sorts of like ways that the distribution of the host trees, if they are host trees for these things, which they are, affect the local ecology. The cottonwood trees have like leaf rollers and all these like internal feeders. So that helps you get at questions of like generalist feeders versus specialist feeders. So specialists that, tend to have a more tightly co-evolved relationship with their host plants can only feed on a few species. Whereas the generalists, like the grasshoppers, can feed across many species. So you can start to get at like these plant insect interaction dynamics with the planted trees. So lots of grasshoppers feeding on the trees this year, internal and external feeders. Maybe thrips, like that might be thrips damage. It's kind of hard. That's a honey locust. So that's like a next step that I'm interested in going in, right? Or even like higher level trophic interactions where you have this ladybug larvae kind of poking in under that leaf roller structure. Something's laying its eggs on the hackberry. Like, what kind of ecosystem services do the trees provide in this way that we're thinking of with like the oaks out east, for example? Yeah, and then we'll see when we go out on the canal, and we should wrap up, that a lot of the oaks have fungal infections. I think it's fungal. I do not think it's leaf scorch, especially this guy with it puckers and it becomes very, very rough. I think is a fungal infection. There's one called, I don't know if I'm going to say it right, anthracnose. Yes. That is present in Colorado. That potentially that's it. But like, so my goal is we're taking really good pictures and we're making collections, actual collections of the leaves that are going into their herbarium. So you'll see them come through to work with like extension agents or other folks that can help us make identifications. And funding and my field crew. I have 2 grad students that have done their thesis work on not this tree stuff, but we have all sorts of stuff going on the Highline Canal, and we get funding from different folks, and that's it. And that did take an hour and a half, and I did not expect it to. So. Okay. How can I see folks online? Should I stop share? That might help. And the chat right here. Okay. Okay. Yeah, there was a comment here. Can you correlate or combine the distance to the water and the soil moisture? Less distance equals lower soil moisture could be better for tree growth. And yeah, that's exactly one of the goals, is to figure out not just how much soil moisture is there, but how does it relate to where the tree is, and can you site the trees more optimally based on that? So
This is clay soil.
Yeah, it's not totally just clay. We did do soil texture the first couple years. And it's anywhere from like silty, clay, loam. It's a lot of it is in that clay category, but there's different proportions of like silt and sand mixed in. But it, yeah, it's pretty clay, but not the heaviest clay around Denver that I've seen. So, okay. So folks online, we're going to move on to the outdoor portion of the day. Thank you so much for being here. Okay. Take care, everybody. I'm going to end the Zoom.